To say that this is joint work with my colleague Suresh is a little disingenuous. This is more his work than my work. Unfortunately, he couldn't quite make it today. So he's really the expert in cyber-physical systems. I'm sort of a hired gun to add a little bit of more formal rigor. So if I get something wrong about, cyber-physical systems, you can blame me, and I'll make sure I learn my lesson, and he'll know about it. So when we say cyber-physical systems, we're talking about a wide range of things, right? We heard about medical devices, but cars, vehicles, gas pumps. Something like an aircraft carrier has, is maybe one cyber-physical system, has many on it. So they pervade the space in many areas. What we're going to be focused on for cyber-physical systems is a notion that we call process model inconsistency. And this is a control loop effect that commonly arises from attacks on cyber-physical systems. The main contribution of this work is to give a rigorous formal definition of what process model inconsistency might be in a formal model of cyber-physical systems, and to elucidate the relationship among incorrectness, incompleteness, inconsistency, and safety. So in particular, we have some results that say a complete and correct model of your system might still lead to some notion of inconsistency, and I'll say explicitly what I mean by that later. But maybe equally importantly is if you have an incomplete model, you can't avoid necessarily ending up in an inconsistent state. And again, I'll say exactly what I mean by that later. But the real importance of this is to sort of shine the spotlight on the limitations of observability and what that can mean about defensive mitigations that you might be able to apply. Okay, so what is this control loop? So here's a well-known sort of breakdown of what of how you might view a cyber-physical system. It is maybe a cleaner breakdown than really exists, but you have this sort of cyber up top and physical on the bottom, and you have a controller that sits in the cyber part that controls some physical process. And it does that by figuring out more or less what state that process is in by getting measurements from sensors and maybe some control inputs from, let's say, a human or some other external source, and sending out signals to control that process through actuators. And that, of course, then gets fed into the controlled process, which acts in the real world in some way. And those actions cause effects that can be measured by the sensors. And so you have this loop. And of course, this happens in a setting where there might be other disturbances that, nothing is deterministic here, really. So this controller really, either implicitly or explicitly, has to maintain some kind of what we'll call a known process model. This is what it knows is possible in the real world. Of course, it might be wrong about what is possible, but that's sort of what is maintained. It has some notion of what to do based on what it's seeing. And then there's really some ground truth, and we may as well represent that for our purposes in a similar way, so we'll call it a ground truth model of what is really happening in the system. So this is a control loop, and the controller itself on the top of that really kind of has its own internal, let's say, OODA loop. It has to, look at the sensor data it's getting, so it's observing something. It has to sort of figure out what it means, decide what to do, and then act by sending signals. Our focus today is really going to be on the observation, because that's we want to, as I said, shine the spotlight on where the limitations are there. So just a little bit more about why we want to study control loop effects. Basically, the kinds of effects that we just heard about in the previous talk often manifest themselves in ways in the control loop. And so if you knew that something was going wrong by finding some kind of problem in your control loop, that might give you information about the original attack that's causing it. So if you're able to detect that you have inaccurate estimated values or something, that might be a sign of some kind of information deception on a cyber component. So cyber effects lead to sort of consequences in the control loop. Same goes for physical effects. So that's sort of the same. Okay, let me jump into a little bit more about what this sort of, it's pretty a simple model, but formal and rigorous of what, of how we're thinking about these systems. So sensors, as I said, they're really recording physical measurements, and we're going to put those in what we'll call a multivariable. So these are typically fine-grained or possibly even continuous measurements, although often the measurement process discretizes things. So think of like infrared pressure, speed, physical quantities like that. If we think about the state of the system in any way that we can reason about, you typically have to chunk those up in more coarse-grained ways. So these are often tuples of discrete values. So if you think of like an elevator, well, what state is the elevator in? Well, you say, well, what floor is it on? Is the car door open? Is the floor door open, et cetera? These are sort of discrete things. But notice that there's sort of a disconnect here. So you may have unexpected or unknown sort of measurement values that you don't know how to interpret or sort of go uninterpreted during the operation of the system. So when the elevator car is between floors, if your model didn't really account for that, then you're sort of missing something. So we consider that we have some, some space P of possible measurement values, and a partial map from those into states. Partial again, because we might have some values that we hadn't really considered were possible, even though they are. And that function f will be a surjective function because we're really sort of defining what the states are here through this function f. So again, either explicitly or often implicitly, the controller in a control loop has to maintain some kind of known process model in this way. So there's a set of states and transitions among them that arise from the measured quantities that it's getting from the sensors. So this represents the designer or the operator's best understanding of what is possible, what states and transitions are possible in the system. Now, of course, the ground truth might be different. Okay, so we might represent the ground truth in a similar way, but this is likely to contain more information because it will account for unintended behavior as well. So potentially random faults or malicious attacks. So let's be careful. I'm not claiming that we can construct the ground truth model a priori. But rather through sort of testing and evaluation, you might get a better sense of what the ground truth really is, and now we can start to ask questions about how that known process model that is maintained in the controller relates to the ground truth. So the ground truth model might have states that don't exist, we'll call those forced states, or transitions, which we'll call forced transitions. Now, of course, these might not be in any correspondence, but we hope they are in relatively close correspondence because that's the whole point of the controller. So this diagram on the right is what we're going to use to sort of help us mathematically or logically track the connection between them. So we can think of the reachable or the real model on the bottom as having some more complete set of measurement values that really exist. And the ones that are being fed into the controller is maybe some subset. So we have some inclusion iota on the left side of that diagram. And then we might have some projection which goes back, which is sort of the natural inverse. And so that might be a partial function. And so this diagram we're going to use, and I'll walk you through it, but the paper has more details to understand exactly how we can track when things are going right or going wrong with the connection between the known model and the sort of ground truth model. So what are some simple things that can go wrong? Well, for one, your known model might be incomplete. You might be missing states that are really possible or transitions that are really possible. Okay, this is in fact almost unavoidable, and so it's very common. We might be incorrect in that we might think that things are possible. Oh, I think this elevator can go up to floor 6, but the building is only 5 stories tall. Okay. I'm actually less concerned with those, in part because sometimes your known model will account for things that aren't really possible just in case. So that seems maybe less dangerous, whereas incompleteness means you're missing something, and so you might be deceived in some way. So these are two common things that that might make these two models disagree. I want to point out that this sort of completeness, incompleteness, the relation between these actually has nothing to do with the safety of the system or safety properties. These are actually orthogonal notions. So you might have in the real model some states like S1 prime that exist you didn't know about that really are unsafe. But not every such state is necessarily unsafe. S2 prime might be perfectly safe, you just hadn't thought about it, and that's no real problem as far as safety is concerned. On the other hand, you might be fully aware of some unsafe states like S2, and be aware of some transitions into them from something like S1, and you might prepare to, your system to limit those kinds of transitions. But if you're unaware of, say, a transition from S3 into S2, that's a potential danger because you're not really prepared to put in mitigations to help limit that. So this is really just to say that the relationship between the known model and the ground truth model is really orthogonal to any question of safety. Although, of course, if you're not really sure where you are, you're not necessarily sure if you are going to be safe. So let's talk about what it means to say, if the controller is sure what state it's in. We have to talk about what observability looks like in the known model with respect to this ground truth model. So what can it observe? Well, it's sort of contingent on whether it has enough measured physical quantities. So, So let's say we have our system really has, is characterized by some set of physical quantities here in PR. And that's going to correspond to some real, some real state. Well, if we follow this through, we might not actually have enough measured physical quantities that the controller knows about to really observe this state at all. And so that's one way in which we might lack the ability to observe. And as I mentioned before, these physical measurements get mapped into some notion of state, but not everything is necessarily mapped in that way. And so if we don't fall into the domain of this FK, we might still sort of fail to observe the real state of the system. So these are two sort of ways in which things might go wrong in the known model, and the known model might not be able to keep track of reality. But for me, what I think is most interesting is you might be able to track this through. You think you're in some state, but is it really the real state? And so if it is, then you've done a good job, and hopefully that is true most of the time. But if not, then you have some incorrect observation, and that's also possible. So that's basically what our notion of process model inconsistency is. We'll take a slightly more dynamic approach. We'll say that when you have a ground truth transition that occurs between two ground truth states, SA and SB, that arise from some measured variable assignments, PA and PB, and you'll have an inconsistency basically if either PA or PB is unobservable or is incorrectly observed. So just to kind of play this out in this toy diagram, if the pink is what you're observing and the green is what is real, so pink you might start observing the real thing in S3 and transition into S2 prime, which in this particular case happens just to be unobservable. Okay, so that is an instance of some process model inconsistency. And of course, the other version is you might be in state 3, really transitioning to S2, but something about the physical quantities that you're feeding into the controller make the controller think you're in S1 instead. And so you haven't realized that you've transitioned to S2, you think you've gone someplace else. And so this inconsistency arises, and that's when further problems can compound and have further effects. So here is really the two main results that we can say by formalizing it in this particular way. This was interesting when I realized this. Well, one, process model inconsistency can occur even if your known process model is correct and complete. Now, when I first said that, I thought, that's weird. But if you think about it, it makes sense because those are really static properties of what is possible, whereas process model inconsistency is a dynamic property of understanding or not, what state you really are in. So in that diagram on the right, maybe we have a correct and complete model, but we're just unable to realize that when we transition from S1 to S2, we think we've gone to S3. So the model is not wrong. There's something wrong with the observation itself. So that sort of tells us that there are some limits as to as to what we can do in sort of putting things into the model to begin with. The second main result is that if you do have an incompleteness, then that means that there's some forced transition, there's some transition you didn't know was possible that really is. And so if you take that transition, then one of two things occur. You either find an instance of process model inconsistency, or you observe what looks like an impossible transition. So here, on the bottom right, we really transitioned from S3 to S2. We correctly observed that we were in S3, and now we're really correctly observing we're in S2, but we just didn't think that was possible. So if we're paying attention, we might be surprised. If we're not paying attention, we might just say, oh, hey, we're in S2. So this comes back to what I was said at the beginning. The top one is really saying correctness and completeness can't preclude process model inconsistency. And the bottom one says that incompleteness really sort of ensures that process model inconsistency will exist, modulo this little impossible transition kind of thing. Okay, so that's the high-level sort of formal results. Let's look a little bit at what this might look like in something more realistic. So please don't squint and try to read this. This is just taken from a paper by Iqbal and others on a model of an ATM that was, I believe this, yes, so it's a formal verification of this model. And so you can think of this as being the known model. This is what they knew was possible for the ATM. And yet there are attacks against this kind of thing that involve like card trapping, where it just takes your card and doesn't give it back. Cache trapping, where it dispenses the cache, but the door doesn't open, and the attacker comes by later to open it. Or jackpotting, in which all the verification routines are bypassed, and please give me money, and it just says, yeah, sure, here you go. So I don't want to delve into depth here, but I just want to sort of point out that these attacks can really manifest as an incompleteness of this known model. So let's just take a look at the left side of this diagram where we have card trapping. So you finish your transaction, it prints the receipt, and the machine says, okay, I sent the signal to eject the card, and the physical process is supposed to eject the card. But the attack does something to prevent that from happening. And so the ATM itself, in this case, probably has no extra measured quantities to know whether or not that has occurred. It just says, hey, I sent the signal. I must be in that state. So it's probably going to think it's in the eject card state, when in reality we're in some other unknown state that the attacker can later come back and bring it back into sort of eject the card for themselves. And so the cache trapping and the jackpotting can also be sort of viewed in this manner. Okay, so I'd like to sort of wrap up with talking a little bit more about what the implications are. So I'm a foundations theory guy, but what does this really mean as far as what we can and can't do? So for one thing, we can talk about attack detection, right? As we just saw in the cache trapping, if you don't have enough measured quantities, you might really fail to detect attacks as they're happening. So it's difficult but important to try to maintain your known process model and keep it as up to date with what you know is possible as you can. Unfortunately, my opinion is you will never be perfect, so you will always have incompleteness in your model. And so, there's only so much you can do, but just because there is only so much you can do doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Now, behavioral analysis is important, but what this kind of tells us is that there are some severe limitations. So if you're not observing accurately what's happening, or at all what's happening, then that's a fundamental limitation to being able to detect attacks based on your behavior. If your known model doesn't account for things that might go wrong, you're not going to figure that out through behavioral analysis. You might do some kind of anomaly detection, like those impossible transitions. If you're aware enough to see that happening, you might use that to your advantage. But you can't guarantee that all of these things are going to manifest in that way, and so that's a pretty important limitation to keep in mind when it comes to anomaly detection. My colleague Suresh is really interested in cyber testing and evaluation. We heard that in the last talk that testing is often not done, and in part, I think it's because these devices are made for their mission, what they're used for. They're not fully instrumented to do intrusion detection, all this stuff. Testing, you really do want to do that. So testing and evaluation typically requires additional sensors, and so it is much more costly to do that. But it's important to do that because that is how you can sort of reduce the gap between what the known model is and what really the ground truth model is. And now, of course, system design, this first point, of course, you want design approaches that, protect against these sort of unexpected forced transitions. You'd like to be able to do that. But I'd like to say you'd like more than that. You'd like to have recovery and resilience. And so one way in which that manifests that people are familiar with is recovery or resilience from hazardous or unsafe states. But I'd like to introduce some notion here that is maybe more difficult to know how we would do this, and this is really sort of speculative future work. How would you do graceful recovery from process model inconsistency? So the whole notion of process model inconsistency is you think you're in some state, and you don't know you're not in that state. So you don't even know you should be recovering from anything. And then, even if you say, okay, well, maybe I'm inconsistent, let's try to recover, how do you know what to do if you think you don't have the right picture of the world? You don't know reliably what your actions will have on the world. So I think this is a really interesting, hard problem for future investigation. I wish I had, answers or ideas about it, which I don't, but I'd like to get others to think about that. So that's basically all I have to say. This is just a replay of the sort of main takeaways. So I think I'll stop now and take questions. I'd also encourage anyone, if you think about it in the future, to reach out to us by email for questions. My colleague Suresh is very interested in finding collaborations, so we're quite open to that as well. Thank you.